From inside the warehouse at Oriole Park at Camden Yards, it is the MASN All Access Podcast. Paul Mancano and Brendan Mortensen here with you. Brendan, as you can hear from my voice, I am sick.
Yeah.
This was you a couple weeks ago. It is me now. I made a trip up to snowy Syracuse, and I came back with the Syracuse flu.
That'll happen.
It's not
in
a flu.
Syracuse because you go up and it's about 30 degrees colder than anywhere else on the planet, seemingly.
Yeah, and with an extra foot of snow.
Right.
That you were not expecting. And I got it. I was on a panel when I was there,
Flex.
Brendan. Huge flex.
That's a massive flex.
Absolutely massive flex. And I was on with a couple other people, and I realized the ultimate faux pas that I never want to make, that this poor woman made on the panel alongside me when she was talking about making a good impression in the industry. We're talking to students and how you treat people is important. And
right.
if you show up and you're energized and you work hard as an intern, that'll go far. And she was using that as a point. And then she said, like I know you interned, she pointed to a student for NBC the one summer that I was there. And he said, me? And she said, yeah. And he said, that wasn't me.
Oh, no.
And she was using it as a point to say, I remembered you because you were great.
That's brutal.
And she clearly remembered the wrong person.
That's just tough.
I felt very bad. You just have to be so certain of something like that before you pull the trigger on it, because it's just all anybody thinks about. And then I would still be thinking about. I'm still thinking about it now, and it wasn't me.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Ugh. I'm secondhand uncomfortable from hearing about that experience.
Because then she had to pivot and was like, well, the person I was talking about, well, he was great. And it just kind of undermines your point.
It's not what you want.
Anytime you're making a statement like that, you have to be so certain of it.
Yeah.
So just something to keep in mind.
That's tough.
Yeah. Well, Brendan, on this podcast today, we're not going to be calling anybody out by name. I'm pretty sure all of our audience, can I say all of our? No, I'm not going to do something like that. I'm going to be discussing with you, Brendan, pitching prospects for the most part, how the Orioles have developed those people, how they have turned them into quality pitchers in some instances, and so in other instances, not so much.
Yeah.
But first, we need a spring training update from you, Brendan.
That we do. Not too many things to update so far. On the injury front, we have DL Hall, who is still ramping up a little bit. He will not be ready to pitch in spring training games until later this month, so that kind of seems like it takes him out of the competition for the Orioles opening day rotation, which is kind of a bummer. I didn't think he was going to make the opening day rotation either way, but it still would have been fun. I think he could have given guys like Dean Kramer a run for his money. So DL Hall kind of out of that competition as of right now. It seems like, can't imagine the Orioles would throw him in the rotation after not really seeing him much during the spring. Presumably going to start in AAA as a starter, assuming he won't start in the bullpen. That's what we've heard so far.
And then Terrin Vavra, another injury, was scratched from the lineup a couple days ago, but appears to be progressing. That appears to not be a serious injury, which is good because of how well Terrin Vavra was playing prior to that injury.
Yeah, everybody keeps using the same pun of tearing it up.
I mean, wouldn't you?
He's been good.
I did.
I'd maybe use it once.
I did.
Yeah.
Are you calling me out?
Maybe.
At Paul Mancano.
Not naming names. We just said off the top of the podcast
we weren't going
to call people out.
Yeah.
Now here I am breaking that rule already.
Exactly. He was 6 for his first 11 in spring training. We were, prior to spring training, giving him the last roster spot on opening day, and so far nothing has changed. I mean, unless somebody goes down with injury, and opening day is 3 weeks from tomorrow, so there still is that possibility. And look at the way that Franchi Cordero and Lewin Diaz, they're hitting the ball very well. But again, Terrin Vavra has the inside track because he can play second base, he can play in the outfield, he's learning first base, and he's already on the 40-man.
Yeah, I think he maybe went up from the last roster spot to the second to last roster spot.
Who goes to the last roster spot? Ryan McKenna?
Maybe Ryan McKenna?
Maybe.
I don't know. Terrin Vavra's just been playing really well. I would be very surprised if he doesn't make the team.
Yeah, although, it is spring training. Another exciting thing, Heston Kjerstad.
Yeah.
This has been the spring of Heston Kjerstad. 7 for his first 13 with 2 homers. He is looking ready to go. Will this be the summer of Heston Kjerstad?
It could be.
Did we say he was going to start in Aberdeen or Bowie on our last podcast?
I think we said he was going to start in Bowie.
Gonna have to go back and listen to that.
I'm 80% sure we said he was going to start in Bowie.
Because he didn't hit particularly well in Aberdeen. Only hit those 5 homers.
Right.
It was only about 60-some games and hit about, 220, 230? So we were kind of expecting, even after that great Arizona Fall League, that he might get some more time in Aberdeen. But, I mean, how much stock can you put into 13 spring training at-bats? But boy, does he look good.
Well, it's not just the spring training at-bats at this point. As you mentioned, he was excellent in the Arizona Fall League. He was the best at the Arizona Fall League, won MVP there. And as the season went along in Aberdeen, he was trending in the right direction. He was hitting much better as the Ironbirds made the playoff push. He was improving a lot. So I wouldn't be surprised if it's not just the overall numbers that the Orioles are looking at from Aberdeen, but you look at the last few weeks he spent there, combine that with the Arizona Fall League and now a really impressive start to spring training, then that might warrant a start in Bowie.
Yeah, maybe. He's turning some heads.
Who knows?
We'll see. We'll see how much playing time he gets over the last couple of weeks, especially because the Orioles have not cut anybody yet. They haven't optioned anybody to AAA. They haven't sent anybody to minor league camp. They have, 71 guys in major league camp right now? That is a ridiculous number. And it's awesome because we're still getting to see Connor Norby and Heston Kjerstad and Joey Ortiz start games, and Colton Cowser, who on MASN hit a 3-run homer the other day.
Right.
We're still getting to see them playing in games. But it's just crazy that the Orioles are saying all these guys are considered good enough so far for our big league team. We don't want to send anybody home.
Right. And especially those guys
Not
that
home
are at
to minor league camp.
Right. And the guys who are at the upper levels of the minor leagues right now, they might be able to get some more run with Cedric Mullins now playing for Team USA at the World Baseball Classic. That opens up center field for Colton Cowser, who is getting a spot there today.
Right.
Anthony Santander just left for the World Baseball Classic. Maybe there's some more at-bats to be had there as well. So exciting to see those young guys who are at the upper levels of the minor leagues get to face some big league competition.
I do want to have the word of caution that it is just spring training, and the example I will use will be Yusniel Diaz, unfortunately, who was awesome. Every spring, it felt like. He had 4 spring trainings with the Orioles, went 32 for 108 in those time frames, hit 296 with 2 homers, 3 triples, 8 doubles. And I remember every spring being like, he's turning heads. Maybe he'll make the team out of camp or, start the year in AAA and get a quick call-up. And every year it felt like he couldn't, either injury or poor play, he couldn't get his feet under him. Certain guys are just prone to flashing in spring training. And Yusniel Diaz was one of those guys. So all to say, take it with a grain of sand or a grain of salt or whatever grain you can find.
A small grain.
A small grain, not a large grain of wheat.
Right.
And you are going to have the exact approximation for how important these stats are.
Yeah, Rockabaco wrote on MASNsports.com the other day, well, I think it was this morning, actually. Don't look into spring stats all that much. Don't look into September stats all that much.
Buck Showalter always used to say, don't count September stats.
Right.
So, yeah. But still good to see. These guys are doing well. All right. It's better than the alternative. I'll say that, Brendan.
Yeah.
All right, Brendan. Let's talk about pitching prospects.
Let's do it.
We kind of teased on our last podcast the discussion of looking back at Mike Elias's era so far, 4 years in, and seeing exactly how well the Orioles have done with developing the prospects that they have in their system. And it's a complex conversation, and it has a lot of nuance, and we're going to try to keep this under an hour because there are so many pitching prospects that we could talk about on both sides of the coin, of guys that the Orioles have turned into quality prospects and quality players, and guys that have just flamed out. And it's difficult to parse how much natural talent a guy has and how much the pitching staff, the Orioles player development staff, is able to squeeze out of a guy. It's always difficult to tell exactly. It's like looking at the impact of a manager. How much is the team's natural talent and how much is the impact that the development staff has on this guy.
And it's kind of hard to analyze the Elias regime right now, too, because a lot of the pitching prospects in the system at this point are guys that were brought in pre-Mike Elias. Even Grayson Rodriguez, DL Hall, guys that we have seen have success throughout the minor leagues and are hopefully going to have success at the big league level moving forward, those are not guys that Mike Elias drafted. That was a previous regime that Mike Elias kind of inherited the responsibility of developing. So with a lot of the guys that we're going to talk about, you could make an argument of, well, those aren't really Mike Elias's guys. We don't know what Elias is going to do with guys that maybe not he handpicks, but the people around him are handpicking. I think you can make a case if we're starting with, Grayson Rodriguez, who has had a ton of success in the minor league level and is hopefully going to be a successful big league pitcher. I think you can attribute a lot of his success to the Mike Elias regime because, if you listen to how Grayson Rodriguez talks about the organization, how things have changed since Mike Elias and company got here, Grayson Rodriguez is a completely different pitcher than the pitcher that he was when he was drafted.
Yeah.
I mean, when he was drafted out of high school, he could pump 100-mile-an-hour fastball, and he could get outs that way. But when he started working with a pitching coach like Justin Ramsey, in the minor leagues, he was able to develop a changeup, a pitch he never had before, which turned into arguably the best changeup throughout the minor leagues of any organization.
Yeah.
That's what made him an elite pitcher, his secondary stuff. And I think you can credit Mike Elias and the guys that he has brought in with helping to turn Grayson Rodriguez from a first-round pick with some promise to one of, if not the best pitching prospect in all of baseball.
And it's impossible for us to sit here and say, well, Grayson Rodriguez wouldn't have developed had Mike Elias never stepped in, had the Orioles just gone with the Dan Duquette era for the previous 5 years. It's impossible for us to say what would have happened.
Right.
But what we can do is say the last regime didn't have a great track record of developing guys. And I think Orioles fans sometimes have some PTSD just because of how much the previous regime, the Dan Duquette, Buck Showalter era had, how much trouble they had in developing pitching prospects. And I think their inability to develop a lot of pitching prospects was what ultimately kind of doomed that era and slammed a window shut that seemed wide open for a long period of time. Now, the Orioles won the most games in the American League for over a 5-year stretch, and it was almost entirely due to their lineup and their bullpen. They had Zach Britton and Darren O'Day and those guys in the bullpen locking it down, and they had an incredible lineup with Adam Jones and Chris Davis and Manny Machado and J.J. Hardy. The pitching, the starting pitching during that time frame was typically between 20th and 30th in Major League Baseball. The highest they ever got, starting pitching ERA, was 12th in 2014. It was never the strength of that team. So what did that regime do? They went out and they tried to draft and develop pitchers. We saw it with Dylan Bundy, with Kevin Gausman, high first-round picks. Hunter Harvey was another first-round pick, not drafted as high. Taken 3 pitchers right there that they thought could be pieces of their starting rotation for years to come. And for one reason or another, Bundy and Harvey more to injury, Gausman more to lack of development, they didn't pan out. And it was the failure of those 3 prospects, I think, that helped hasten the downfall of the Dan Duquette era. And then near the back end of it, it was 3 more pitching prospects that were drafted near the end of Dan Duquette's era when they realized, again, we have to reinvest in pitching. So it was guys like Cody Sedlock and DL Hall and Grayson Rodriguez, guys that they realized we're going to have to draft some pitchers in order to back up some of the great hitters that we have right now. And it's a shame that that era wasn't able to see what DL Hall and Grayson Rodriguez can deliver because they appear to have been good picks. Cody Sedlock was not. But it's just crazy to see that the last era was doomed by pitching prospects and the failure of the Orioles to develop those pitching prospects. And I think Orioles fans are concerned that this era of Orioles teams, which is set to be loaded lineup-wise with Adley Rutschman and Gunnar Henderson and future guys like Jackson Holliday, they're worried that this team could be undone by similar things, and we could see panic signings like we saw with Alex Cobb and Andrew Kashner near the end when things weren't going as well and they needed to patch holes.
And it's interesting that Mike Elias hasn't really had to draft pitchers in a similar way that Dan Duquette had to. You mentioned kind of correcting for errors there with guys like Grayson Rodriguez and DL Hall. The Orioles were able to go into their very high draft picks with the idea of, okay, we already have Grayson Rodriguez and DL Hall. Those are the two guys at the top of the farm system right now. And that gave the Orioles the flexibility to be able to draft Adley Rutschman number 1 overall, take Heston Kjerstad number 2, Colton Cowser number 5, Jackson Holliday number 1. Mike Elias has not had to use a first-round pick on a pitcher. Now, whether that's completely by design because of the fact that maybe it's just a little harder to draft pitchers than it is to draft hitters. We've talked about it on previous draft podcasts here. We have mentioned how the Orioles have made it seem like we are more confident in drafting hitters in the first 3 or 4 rounds of the draft, drafting some pitching projects after that, and then acquiring pitchers, whether it's through trades or waiver claims or signings, whatever it may be. That seems to be the Orioles' preferred route. But if you don't have Grayson Rodriguez and DL Hall from the Dan Duquette era, then Mike Elias doesn't have the flexibility to keep drafting hitters in the top 5. And that's what he did for 4 years in a row, which worked out really well. And as you mentioned, the Orioles are going to be stacked in their lineup if these hitting prospects turn out. But are they going to be doomed if Grayson Rodriguez is the only pitching prospect from this farm system that turns out to be what the Orioles need him to be?
Yeah, because when Mike Elias took over, it wasn't just Grayson Rodriguez and DL Hall that we were talking about. If you remember, the Orioles' top 30 prospect list, and in particular, their top 15 was about half pitchers.
Yeah.
Right now, you look at the Orioles' top 30, and especially the top 10, there are only a couple guys in there, Grayson Rodriguez and DL Hall, that are considered top pitching prospects in the Orioles system. And I look at guys like Zach Lowther, Alexander Wells, somebody that he acquired later on, Kevin Smith. Mike Baumann was already in the system. Keegan Aiken was already in the system. You had what you thought was, what we thought from the outside, was a little bit of depth and a little bit of cushion. And the problem is, while we have seen the meteoric rise of Grayson Rodriguez and we've seen the strong development, we'll talk about him later, of DL Hall, it's the cushion that we've seen removed. It's the second tier of pitching prospects that we thought might turn into quality rotation pieces, pitching depth, that we have seen kind of bottom out.
Yeah, when you look at the Orioles' top 30 prospects in 2019, as you mentioned just a few years ago, you've got DL Hall and Grayson Rodriguez both in your top 5.
Yep.
Outside of those two, it's Zach Lowther, number 8, Dean Kramer, number 9, Blaine Knight, number 10, Brennan Hanafy, number 11, and Hunter Harvey, number 12.
Do you mention Keegan Aiken, number 6, too?
Yeah, Keegan Aiken in there as well. I didn't even mention him.
Yeah.
None of those guys are Elias draft picks. None of those guys, Dean Kramer was acquired in a trade. That wasn't a Mike Elias trade. And you can look right now, we're going to talk about Lowther, Wells, Smith, Baumann. I'm going to get to that group of 4 in just a second. They are able to not succeed because you have, right now at least, Kyle Bradish and Dean Kramer. Neither of those guys were acquired by Mike Elias. Kyle Bradish was a part of the Dylan Bundy trade. Dean Kramer was a part of the Manny Machado trade. And both of those guys were able to develop in the minor leagues. That's great. But you got them at the upper levels of the minor leagues.
Right.
We saw Kyle Bradish move very quickly throughout the Orioles system. And yes, he was good at AAA. And yes, he's now been solid for a year at the majors with a lot of promise. But the early stages of Kyle Bradish's development didn't happen in Baltimore.
No.
Same case with Dean Kramer. He moved up through the Orioles system pretty quickly. And when you're looking at guys like Zach Lowther, Alexander Wells, Mike Baumann, Kevin Smith to an extent, who was lower down in the Mets system before the Orioles acquired him, the Orioles were not able to develop those guys. And we talked at length over the last few years on this podcast about how even if one of those guys turns into a starting rotation piece, you'd feel pretty good about that. None of them did. And you could add Dean Kramer and Keegan Aiken into that jumble if you wanted to and say, hey, well, Dean Kramer turned into hopefully a solid starter at the big league level. Keegan Aiken is a solid long reliever. I wouldn't really put those two in that group. I mean, maybe you could put Keegan Aiken there because the Orioles are able to develop him, but he didn't even turn into a starter.
Yeah.
So now we're just talking about a group of guys who were not first-round picks, who didn't have the huge high-end pedigree of being a front-end starter. You just needed them to be a back-end of the rotation starter, and none of them were.
Let's start with the pair of lefties that I think were grouped together so often in their minor league career, and that's Zach Lowther and Alexander Wells. Lowther's now 27. He's still in the Orioles system. He was not a non-roster invitee to spring training, but he is an extra guy who can get work in exhibition games because he makes the trip with the team. He was a 2017 second-round pick by the Dan Duquette era. He peaked at number 12 in the Orioles' top 30 back in 2021. He made his big league debut in 2021, had 6 starts, 6.67, I should say, ERA, high strikeout rate, but was walking almost 4 per 9. Not a good rookie year. 2022, last year, pitched in just 1 big league game, allowed 5 earned runs, and more troubling than that, he had an ERA over 10 in AAA last year. He was removed from the 40-man roster for Jonathan Arauz in mid-June and cleared waivers and remained in the Orioles system. Alexander Wells, international signee, peaked at number 15 in the Orioles' top 30 back in 2020. Made his major league debut in 2021 as well, 6.75 ERA in 11 games. And then last year pitched in just 2 games and allowed 2 earned runs. And really struggled with injuries last year. Pitched in just 11 1/3 innings in Norfolk, and then filed for free agency this past November. 2 guys who are now not part of the Orioles' long-term plans by any stretch. One is out of the organization. 2 guys that, look, they were mid-tier prospects. Your 12th ranked prospect, your 15th ranked prospects, you shouldn't have huge expectations for, but you were hoping one of those 2 guys would pan out, and neither did.
Both crafty lefties who didn't really have overwhelming stuff. You weren't going to see fastballs from either of them get over 94, 95 miles an hour. Their spin rates were both pretty good. There were encouraging signs there. They had solid off-speed stuff. You thought that they didn't really have front end of the rotation potential again, but maybe they could have been a number 4, number 5 starter in the big leagues. Even if it wasn't a huge big league career with tons of success, you thought that they would turn into something at the big league level. But they both continued a trend that we have seen from Orioles pitching prospects, which is you're solid at single A, solid at double A, get to triple A, something happens at triple A, and those pitching prospects just hit a wall. And I understand that between every level of the minor leagues, there is a natural talent jump. It's a lot harder to pitch in double A than it is to pitch in single A. And it's a lot harder to pitch at AAA Norfolk than it is to pitch at AA Bowie. But both of these guys seem to hit the same brick wall that a lot of Orioles pitching prospects have hit at AAA Norfolk, which is pretty concerning. And you can make an argument with both of those guys that, hey, they never really got into a consistent rhythm at the big league level. They didn't know whether they were going to be starting games or coming out of the bullpen. That's really hard to do when you're pitching sporadically against big league hitters. And I understand that argument. But on the flip side of that coin, they never did anything at AAA to say, hey, this guy deserves a shot every 5 days. Kyle Bradish did it last year. He was excellent at AAA Norfolk to start the year, to the point where the Orioles said, this guy needs a shot every 5 days. We're going to let him work through those rookie struggles a little bit because we can see the potential on the other side. He has nothing left to show us at AAA Norfolk. We think he can be a big league rotation piece. Go work it out every 5 days, because that is what Kyle Bradish needs for his long-term development. Zach Lowther and Alexander Wells, they didn't show you enough to say this guy needs a shot every 5 days.
Yeah, and same with Mike Baumann, who was not a crafty lefty. He was a big, strong righty, still in the Orioles system, and I think could get some opportunities with the big league team this year, potentially, but certainly the Orioles don't have the same long-term vision for Mike Baumann that certainly we thought that they did maybe a year ago. And it's the same story, Brendan. Gets to AAA, and in 2021 he got to AAA, and he was great in 6 starts. Not so much last year. A 4.20 ERA last year with Norfolk, bounced back and forth between Baltimore and Norfolk, but was never relied upon hugely in Baltimore. 13 games and had a 4.72 ERA. He's entering his age 27 season now. A guy that peaked higher than Lowther and Wells in the Orioles top 30. I know that's an external rating system, but he got all the way up to number 8 in the Orioles top 10. And another guy that right now, I think it's safe to say, is not a part of the Orioles' long-term plans.
No, I don't think he is a realistic part of this rotation competition right now. I mean, Mike Elias has said that there's about 12 guys who are theoretically competing for a starting rotation spot at this point. Mike Baumann is probably within those 12. But when you talk about the 7 or 8 guys that are realistically in this Orioles starting pitching rotation competition, I don't think Mike Baumann is even really in the group of Spencer Watkins right now. I wouldn't put him in the same tier as Spencer Watkins and Austin Voth.
Right.
When you're looking at the starting rotation. Both of those guys started games really effectively last year. I think Mike Baumann still has a chance to make the big league bullpen. I think if you need another long reliever, right-handed pitcher, then yeah, maybe Mike Baumann gets a call from AAA Norfolk. But I'd be pretty surprised if he cracks the 26-man roster right now.
Yeah, and then Keegan Aiken, somebody who is a little bit more a part of the Orioles' plans than the 3 guys that we just talked about, than Wells, than Lowther, than Baumann, because he has established himself now seemingly as a quality lefty reliever. Probably more of a long reliever than any kind of high-leverage guy, but that's still a valuable spot to be in. Remember, he was somebody who was drafted highly by the Dan Duquette era, somebody who, again, doesn't have outrageous stuff, but has a great spin rate on his four-seam fastball. And I think we will see him in the big league bullpen this year because he had an ERA of 3.20 last year in the big leagues. He is on the upper echelon, on the higher end of the curve of pitching prospects who the Orioles have been able to develop.
Right.
Still, he is not a big league starter, and he's not a big league high leverage reliever.
Yeah, and that's just it. If you want to say, well, Keegan Aiken is a success story out of that group, is he? I mean, he's at the big league level. He's pitching pretty well out of the bullpen, and you're happy about that. You're happy that you have a solid left-handed long reliever, but that's not really what you wanted Keegan Aiken to be. You were hoping that he would be a number 4, number 5 starter at the big league level, and maybe the long reliever wasn't the floor. The floor is probably where Zach Lowther and Alexander Wells are right now, which is probably not any sort of a part of the big league level going forward. So Keegan Aiken didn't hit his floor, but he didn't hit his ceiling.
Right. He's probably in the 40th percentile in terms of outcome.
Yeah. It's not the worst case scenario, but it's certainly not what you were hoping for.
And so those 4 guys, Lowther, Wells, Baumann, and Aiken, like you said, Brendan, Mike Elias and company didn't pick these guys. He didn't bring these guys into the organization. Even Drew Rom, who we expect maybe could make his big league debut this season, predated Mike Elias in this organization. So you could say, when looking at Mike Elias and this front office, that maybe these guys were not great prospects to begin with. And that Elias, given how he values the kind of things that he values when he looks at prospects, draft prospects, guys to get back in trades, that he wouldn't have picked them in the first place.
Right.
And so the front office and the development staff have just been able to squeeze out as much as they possibly can out of guys that didn't have particularly high ceilings to begin with. That's an optimist's view, I think you could say.
Yeah, I would agree. And good question from Mark on YouTube that I want to address here. Can you talk about some of the development philosophy differences between the Duquette era and the Elias era? We don't know a ton of the intricacies, but from what we have heard from guys like Grayson Rodriguez, who was a part of those 2 different regimes, it seemed like when Grayson first got here, the philosophy was a lot of just kind of old school mentality to pitching. It was, hey, Grayson Rodriguez, you have a 100-mile-an-hour fastball. Go use that thing a lot. Use it effectively. And then, you were just kind of approaching hitters with either an overpowering stuff that we saw from Grayson Rodriguez and DL Hall, or some of the guys that they were drafting, like Zach Lowther, the international signing of Alexander Wells. Those were kind of traditional, crafty lefties. It was a lot of an old-school approach to pitching, whereas, Grayson Rodriguez has mentioned himself that with the Mike Elias era, he came in the next year, and as soon as he got there, there were TrackMans. There was technology going into tracking a lot of the analytical data behind their pitching routine. It was giving them a lot of data to support what pitches work when, what you should be doing with your approach, changing mechanics, whatever it might be. We've seen new pitching labs get implemented. So it seems like in terms of developing pitching, the Mike Elias regime has used a lot more kind of current age technology with developing their pitchers and bringing more information to them that they're able to use on the mound.
Yeah, it's tough to give a one-size-fits-all answer here, and I think that's a common question that we get from a lot of people. It's like, what does this front office, what does this development staff emphasize? Do they want pitchers to throw more fastballs? Do they want pitchers to work out of the stretch more? There's no one-size-fits-all answer here. They're just doing the best things for each individual pitcher. But they have a more of a wealth of knowledge about what works for these kind of pitchers and what they can do. Like the pitching lab that you mentioned that Matt Blood talked about on this podcast that they are developing in Bel Air. That's something that Dylan Tate has talked about working at pitching labs. Spencer Watkins has worked at pitching labs.
Right.
These are things that the Orioles are working on internally, and they're encouraging players to go out and do outside of the organization. The Wake Forest pitching lab that they took all the pitching prospects to after they drafted them in 2021. That kind of stuff would never have happened under Dan Duquette and that front office. Now, I think what Grayson Rodriguez experienced was the lower levels of the minor leagues. I mean, Grayson Rodriguez was with this organization with under Dan Duquette for only a matter of months before it changed hands, and he saw a different side of things. So
right.
I think what Mike Elias and staff are doing very well is incorporating all of this technology and all of these development techniques, even at the lower levels, even in Aberdeen, even down to Delmarva and the Florida Complex League. I think the previous regime didn't do that. Right. Maybe they had a little bit more technology. Maybe Grayson, if he had gotten up to AAA under Dan Duquette, would have seen more of that stuff. But that previous regime clearly didn't think it was as important to introduce that kind of technology, make an investment in that kind of technology at the lower levels.
Yeah, I guess the blanket statement would just kind of be giving pitchers and coaches the necessary information to know what best works for pitchers.
Right.
You're using the proper tools and technology, giving them the data to be able to succeed. And it's very individualized, as you mentioned, so you can't really say what pitchers are doing more or less of on an organizational scale.
Right.
But it is on an individual level, giving them the information they need to succeed.
So we talked about 4 guys that were brought in by the previous regime that Mike Elias and company have not so far been able to develop as much as some of the other top-tier pitching prospects. One guy that they brought in that Mike Elias was here for the introduction of, and that was Kevin Smith.
Yeah.
Entering his age 26 season. Now, he was acquired in the Miguel Castro trade. We incorrectly said in the last podcast it was 1-for-1. I incorrectly said that. Victor Gonzalez, who was a recent international signee, was also part of that.
I think it was Kevin Smith and a player to be named later.
Yeah, or Cash, I think was that, and that turned into a player to be named later. So Kevin Smith was brought in by this regime and came in at number 12 in the Orioles' top 30 prospect list. We were praising the trade at the time because of the high tier of prospect that Kevin Smith is. And in 2021, he struggled in Norfolk. 6.23 ERA in 16 games. And then last year had a 4.66 ERA in 19 games, 6 starts in Norfolk. Struggled with injury, was all over the map. Yeah. And I know command has been a big issue with him. And it appears that Kevin Smith right now, he's dropped out of the Orioles' top 30. And we're very unsure about the long-term status of this guy in this organization.
Yeah, it kind of got to the point last year where we didn't really know what was going on with Kevin Smith. I think it was the end of last year where he was in Bowie working with the pitching coaches, but he wasn't actually pitching in games. Like, you would just see him warming up, but he wasn't actually getting any game action.
Yeah.
So Kevin Smith went from a pitching prospect that we were really excited about to we don't even really know where he is in the minor league system. And, Kevin Smith, I think, is the highest profile pitcher that Mike Elias has brought in. If you remember, too, in the Jose Iglesias trade as well, Mike Elias brought in 2 pitchers there. Brings in Garrett Stallings, who was very briefly in the Orioles top 30. I think he was like literally 30th.
Yeah.
So he was kind of there. Garrett Stallings has not put up very good numbers in the minor league system. Gene Pinto kind of seems like the better pitcher of that trade. Gene Pinto was an international signing by the Angels who was kind of the throw-in along with Garrett Stallings in that deal. He looks pretty good, but scouts and, Steve Molesky has talked about Pinto a lot, where he's very short. He doesn't really have the tools, you would say, to be a big league type of pitcher. So he's put up good minor league numbers, and, we've seen shorter pitchers just kind of surprise you in the big league level, but I don't know if Gene Pinto has big league potential at this point.
He was very good in Aberdeen last year, but I think in his age 22 or 23 season.
Yeah.
So he's a little bit behind. He's got to catch up a little bit. So those are guys that the Orioles brought in that have had middling success to not so great success. And I think this goes into what Mike Elias's philosophy is, which is that pitching is in general very hard to develop, and it's very hard to identify. And so the reason that they take these high draft picks and they use them on position player prospects is because they like the more sure thing of position player prospects.
Right.
They wait until the later rounds to take Carlos Tavera like they did in the 5th round a couple of years ago. They wait until the later rounds. I think it was in the 3rd round last year where they took the two-way player who ended up not signing out of Oregon State. They wait because they believe they would rather use the high dollar amount picks on guys that they are pretty sure will work out, and they will wait until later for the pitching prospects. The problem is, though, does that limit your ability to acquire top-tier pitching prospects, period? Grayson Rodriguez and DL Hall were middle first-round picks, but they were first-round picks. The Orioles, under Mike Elias, haven't spent any first-round picks on pitchers. They may not be able to acquire somebody who immediately jumps into their top 10 in terms of their prospect list for the near future, for a long time.
They haven't so far.
And will they even be able to? Because now they're going to be picking 17th in this draft. If all things go to plan, they're going to be picking 17th or later. They're going to be at least picking in the middle part. They're not going to be getting a top pick in the draft unless the lottery balls bounce their way for some reason. Now they have the lottery. So are they even going to be able to acquire these guys? And unless they sell off one of their top-tier players, they're not going to be able to acquire a top-tier pitching prospect via trade. They're going to have to rely on developing these guys. They're going to have to rely on drafting guys in the 5th, 6th, 7th round and then turning them into something that is way better than their draft stock.
Yeah, we've been talking about Zach Lowther, Alexander Wells, Mike Baumann for the last half hour or so. I think the natural question from that is, so these guys didn't work out.
Right.
It doesn't really seem to be making a huge impact on the big league level right now, right? Because you have 5 guys right now in your starting rotation with Kyle Gibson, Cole Irvin, who you acquired. You have Grayson Rodriguez, who is a top-flight pitching prospect that Mike Elias didn't need to worry about drafting. So he is presumably in the rotation. And then you have Dean Kramer and Kyle Bradish, 2 guys who were acquired via trade before Mike Elias even got here, and the Orioles were able to develop them, and now they look like they're in the starting rotation. So what? Zach Lowther and Alexander Wells, Mike Baumann don't work out. Who cares? But I think the issue with that is not those guys. It is the issue that they represent, as you mentioned, which is the Orioles clearly have not felt comfortable drafting pitchers in the first few rounds. And we aren't really going to see any pitchers come up throughout the minor league levels that the Orioles drafted that are super exciting. I mean, you have guys like Carlos Tavera, who, is maybe an exciting pitching prospect, but
he's not in the top 30.
He's not in their top 30. He was, a 5th or 6th round pick?
5th round pick, I believe, yeah.
So Carlos Tavera is kind of the pitching prospect from an Orioles draft class that we're talking about. And if I am looking at evaluating what Mike Elias is able to do with guys that he has either drafted or acquired in some way and how he can develop them, it's the group of Cade Povich, Chase McDermott, Seth Johnson.
Yeah.
That is kind of, to me, the new Lowther, Wells, Bauman.
Except he did acquire them.
Except you can't make a case anymore that, well, Zach Lowther didn't work out because he wasn't a Mike Elias guy.
Yeah.
Alexander Wells, not a Mike Elias guy. All three of these guys, Mike Elias acquired via trade.
He bought the ingredients.
Right. So if Cade Povich, Chase McDermott, Seth Johnson don't work out, I mean, maybe you could fall back on an argument again of, well, they weren't Mike Elias draft picks. And then you could just continue that cycle over and over. But at this point, the guys that Mike Elias has brought in, they are hand-picking these guys right now.
Yeah.
So if Cade Povich, Chase McDermott, Seth Johnson, if none of those guys turn into a big league starting pitcher, then you really have to look at how this front office is able to acquire and develop pitching prospects. Because the onus does not fall on Dan Duquette anymore.
Yeah.
That's all Mike Elias.
It is strange, too, because the Orioles have done such a good job in taking guys who were already at the big league level and had failures elsewhere and turning them into quality pitchers. Austin Voth being the prime example of somebody who struggled mightily in Washington. Orioles pick him up off waiver claims in his age 29 season and turn him into a quality pitcher who might be in the bullpen, might be a reliever this year. Spencer Watkins, Brandon Hyde said the other day, more credit needs to be thrown at Spencer Watkins for everything he did for this team last year.
Yeah.
As a spot starter, a fill-in starter, somebody who, again, is up there in age. He's no longer a 25-year-old. He's closer to 30. And yet he filled in. He bounced around from team to team. The Orioles pick him up on a minor league deal and are able to get some quality innings out of him. The weird thing is they're able to do this well with guys that have failures elsewhere in the big leagues and get them in. It's the guys that they get at the lower levels. It's the guys that they get in the minor leagues that they can't quite push over the hump.
Right. And honestly, if I'm looking at Povich, McDermott, Johnson, if one of those guys a few years down the line doesn't turn into a big league starting pitcher, I think I have major questions about the Orioles' ability to acquire and develop pitching prospects. If they are going to continue to draft hitters in the first few rounds, that's fine. It's a strategy that has seemed to work out so far because you've been able to draft guys even outside of the first round. Gunnar Henderson was not a top pick. He is still obviously turned into something great. He's the number one prospect in all of baseball right now. Jordan Westberg, guys that weren't drafted.
30th overall pick.
30th overall pick. Joey Ortiz was a fourth-round pick. You have a lot of guys. Kyle Stowers, second-round pick. They have been able to draft guys outside of the first round as hitters that they have developed into quality and hopefully good big league pieces for years down the line. They have yet to do that with a pitcher.
Right.
And right now they're getting by because you have Grayson Rodriguez, you have DL Hall, you have Bradish and Kramer that you acquired via trade. That's four guys that Mike Elias did not bring in. And it kind of leaves you in a position where you need to sign Kyle Gibson in free agency because you don't have the talent in-house at the front end of the rotation. You need to trade for somebody like Cole Irvin, take away from your minor league depth, and go get somebody like that. And maybe that's easier to do.
Yeah.
Maybe it's easier to draft a hitter like Darryl Hernandez out of high school, develop him, turn him into a top 15 prospect that you can then flip for a solid big league arm that has already developed throughout his respective minor league system. You don't have to worry about getting him to that point. Maybe that's just easier, and maybe that's the philosophy that this front office has. But you'd still like to see them draft and develop a pitcher.
I think going forward, it's going to be interesting to see, now that they are picking 17th in the draft, are they going to start to use these mid to late first-round picks that they might have for the next several years on pitchers? Now that they're out of the phase, hopefully, of drafting in the top 5, are they going to change their philosophy and say, we're going to take bigger swings on pitching now because we got the foundational pieces we needed out of those drafts? That's going to be an interesting thing to see. And again, like you said, Brendan, so what? Can the Orioles continue to get by like this? This may not be an issue. If the Orioles play their cards right and they use all the depth that they have position player-wise in their system to trade for pitchers, maybe this is okay. Maybe this is much ado about nothing, and we're talking about something that isn't an issue because the Orioles have so much depth elsewhere that they are able to trade for guys, because they push the left field wall back, that they are able to sign pitchers a little bit better, a little bit cheaper for longer term. But it could also be an issue, and I think what fans are concerned about long term, I don't know how many fans are concerned about this, but the long-term concern could be, could we get to another phase where we're going out and overpaying for Alex Cobb and Andrew Kashner to fill holes in our rotation because we're so desperate at this point?
Yeah, it's a good point of, do you even have to? Could you just keep drafting hitters that you develop really well and trade them for big league rotation pieces, and you don't have to ever draft a pitcher?
Right.
Because you're just trading the depth that you have from your hitters, trading for guys, or you're just signing pitchers in free agency because you don't have to sign hitters, because you've just developed all of them throughout your minor league system and you don't have any holes in the lineup, and you can just spend your money in free agency on starting pitchers and then you're good to go. But the question there becomes, what does your minor league system look like? What does the minor league system look like right now as we are entering the phase where the Orioles are not going to be trading quality veteran position players at the big league level, we presume. We don't think they're going to be offloading talented players for prospects at this point because they're trying to make a playoff push down the line. What does this farm system look like, or even the top 30 look like right now, if you don't trade Trey Mancini and Jorge Lopez last year? That's no Povich, no McDermott, no Johnson, which means you have Grayson Rodriguez and DL Hall in your top 30. And then a long way down the list, you have Drew Rom, who you also did not draft. And then that's pretty much it.
Well, then we should give credit to Elias for making those trades
right.
as well.
And that's great. But it's just interesting to look at the fact that you only have kind of the middle tier of pitchers in your top 30 prospects right now because you traded veterans last year, which you're not going to do.
Right.
So that strategy is kind of gone.
Yeah.
The way that you acquired Povich and McDermott and Seth Johnson, that's not a viable strategy anymore.
So the litmus test truly is going to be those three guys.
Right.
I mean, it has to be. And the other interesting one that we haven't really talked about is DL Hall. I mean, Grayson Rodriguez is, everything that the Orioles hoped he would be, and he has been an A+ in terms of development thus far. We'll see how he translates to the big leagues. The Orioles have done an incredible job developing Grayson Rodriguez from a mid-first-round pick into one of the best pitching prospects in baseball and potentially a future ace. DL Hall, at one point, was higher than Grayson Rodriguez in the Orioles prospect rankings. We still say has a ton of potential. Are the Orioles able to squeeze that potential out of him and turn him into a viable big leaguer long-term? I don't think we'll get our answer this year, but maybe next year and the year after that. DL Hall is going to be another interesting test to see how well can the Orioles do with a guy like this.
And here's my follow-up to that. Don't they kind of have to? Right? Like, I mean, you have Grayson Rodriguez.
Because Lowther, Wells,
right.
Bauman, those guys didn't work out.
DL Hall kind of has to succeed. You have Grayson Rodriguez, who has front end of the rotation potential. After Grayson Rodriguez, you have Kyle Bradish, who we both really like, but I don't think Kyle Bradish is going to be an ace. Not that you necessarily need him to be if Grayson Rodriguez turns into one. But I don't know if Kyle Bradish's ceiling is much higher than a number 3 starter at the big league level. I don't think Dean Kramer's ceiling is much higher than a number 4, number 5 starter at the big league level. So I know it doesn't always work like that. Sometimes you just have a jumble of starters. It doesn't need to be 1 is better than 2, 2 is better than 3, and so on. But you need a few guys, especially if you are looking at a potential playoff rotation. You need a few guys who you feel really confident going out for a playoff start that can just have an absolute gem, right? Maybe Kyle Bradish can do it. He's inconsistent. Maybe Dean Kramer can give you one every once in a while. But you need the type of pitcher that we think Grayson Rodriguez can be. Grayson Rodriguez is really the only one that the Orioles have right now with that kind of potential.
Yeah.
DL Hall, I think, is the only other one that you could make a case for, but he hasn't shown it enough over the last few years. I know he's dealt with injuries, and we haven't really seen DL Hall at full strength. He looked excellent at the back end of last year coming out of the bullpen, but he kind of needs to be that number 2 or number 3 type of starter because the Orioles don't really have it anywhere else. And you can acquire those guys via trade. You can sign them in free agency, but you'd like to have them in-house if you can.
The one thing we can say is the previous regime also had the negative aspect of they would deal guys away or lose guys, pitchers, that would end up having great careers elsewhere. Jake Arrieta being the prime example.
Kevin Gausman,
who sometimes incorrectly by fans, I understand it can get confusing, gets attributed to Mike Elias. Some people say, Mike Elias traded away Kevin Gausman.
Yeah.
That happened before Mike Elias took over. And also, we forget that Kevin Gausman struggled in Atlanta before he eventually found his feet.
He did.
Alex Cobb is the only guy I think you could say struggled in Baltimore and had a better career elsewhere.
Dylan Bundy had like a solid year after, but he has really fallen off since.
It was 11 games in 2020.
Yeah.
I'm kind of willing to, and clearly, I mean, he's still out in the free agency market right now. But Cobb, remember, struggled in Baltimore in Elias's first year, and then had a 3.76 ERA in 2021 and a 3.73 ERA last year. So turned into a pretty good pitcher.
Yeah, in one of the better one of the better pitchers parks in all of baseball as well in San Francisco. So, but yes, I agree.
Yeah. Other than that, I mean, give all the credit in the world to Evan Phillips, who had a phenomenal year last year with the Dodgers, 1.14 ERA, but he also had a brief stint in Tampa Bay last year. This happens. Zach Pop as well, who, again, though, I don't think the Orioles willingly gave him away. I think they thought Zach Pop was not going to get taken in the Rule 5 draft.
Yeah, but he's been very good.
He has. They probably, I think if Michael Elias had a do-over, would say I would have protected him from the Rule 5 draft.
If they got one takesies backsies. He would be a takesies backsies.
I think it would be Mike Yastrzemski, probably.
I don't know. Yeah, probably.
Yeah. So there are a couple instances, but also every team has instances of that. Every team has... They traded away, Fernando Tatis Jr. when he was just a prospect. So stuff like that happens to even the best of organizations. And Michael Elias doesn't have too many examples right now of trading away pitching prospects or pitchers who then turn out to be phenomenal elsewhere.
No, even Jorge Lopez struggled in the second half of last year in Minnesota. Obviously, wish the best for Jorge Lopez, but that trade right now seems pretty good.
Tanner Scott, Cole Sulser as well.
Both struggled in Miami.
Exactly.
There was, I think at some podcasts, Paul, we'll go back and now we can finally start evaluating some of the early Mike Elias trades that he has made. We can't really evaluate, the Trey Mancini, Jorge Lopez trades at this point because those guys are still in the minor leagues. But you can look at trades like Cole Sulser and Tanner Scott, even for what the Orioles got back in the minor league system right now and what both of those guys have done so far. Pretty good trade.
They got the draft pick that turned into, was it Judd Fabian?
Judd Fabian.
So that was a weird draft pick trade, which doesn't often happen.
Yeah.
But you can trade those competitive balance round picks. Yeah. Anyway, all right, Brendan. We've talked a lot about the pitching prospects, and there still is a lot to be written on those pitching prospects. And I think this year will be a very important year for the pitching prospects in the Orioles system that Michael Elias has acquired, and also for some of the guys at the big league level that we've seen the Orioles pin their hopes upon.
Yeah, this was a very inside baseball podcast, so thanks for sticking with us. But my takeaway from this is that you can make arguments about Lowther, Wells, Baumann not necessarily being this front office's guys. So I think the microscope is really going to be on Cade Povich, Chase McDermott, and Seth Johnson whenever he's able to return to the mound. Not really sure what his timetable looks like recovering from Tommy John. Probably on a John Means-esque sort of timeline where maybe we'll see him back in July or August. But those three guys, you can't really make any excuses for.
Right.
Mike Elias brought them in. He now has the task of developing them. They have all, from scouts around baseball, Cade Povich especially has gotten pretty high marks. He's been on some top 100 lists. So is Mike Elias and his regime able to develop their own pitching prospects. And their own is even a loose term because they acquired them via trade. But this is about as close to their own guys as we're going to get.
And Carlos Tavera and their draft picks.
Right.
Those guys as well. You can lump into that category. And if they do develop them well, we'll have Matt Blood on again to take a victory lap. And just to...
A well-deserved one. Because if the Orioles are able to develop some of their pitching draft picks, I mean, that's a huge win. Because they hardly draft those guys in the first 5 rounds.
Exactly. Well, important couple of years coming up for the pitching prospects and the Orioles pitching depth. At Brendan Morty is his Twitter handle. I am at Paul Mancano. Thanks so much to Amy Jennings for producing this podcast. 3 weeks from tomorrow, opening day. Get your sleep in now. Because it's not going to be easy. Hopefully I sound a lot better on the next podcast and a lot less nasally.
Yeah.
One can only hope. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we will be back next week, and we'll catch you next time.